According to Fortune, the latest AI power struggle is not just about models and chips, but about who owns the most valuable asset in the modern economy, enterprise data. Welcome back to the show. In this episode, we're going to unpack what this means for investors, especially anyone watching Palantir, Microsoft, and the broader AI ecosystem. According to Fortune, Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella has issued a very explicit warning to enterprises using frontier AI models from labs like OpenAI and Anthropic. His core claim is that enterprises are effectively paying twice. They pay once in cash for token usage, and again in the form of proprietary knowledge and corrections that flow back into the model and enrich the lab. For investors, this is a signal that one of the largest beneficiaries of frontier AI is reframing the market narrative. Nadella is not just talking about cost optimization. He's calling out a fundamental strategic risk, that frontier AI labs are quietly accumulating institutional know-how from their largest customers, and that this know-how can be used to one day compete with those same customers. From a stock perspective, this matters in several ways. First, it confirms that data ownership and control are becoming central differentiators in enterprise AI. That directly overlaps with the positioning Palantir has been pushing very aggressively, that data retention is your treasure, and that enterprises need a sovereign layer between their data and whatever model they use. Second, it suggests that even hyperscalers like Microsoft see a ceiling to the current just plug into frontier APIs model. Nadella's proposed fix is for companies to retain ownership of their data and build proprietary learning environments in the cloud, with orchestration layers that allow easy switching among AI providers. Conveniently, Microsoft sells exactly that architecture through Azure and its own orchestration solutions. For investors, this reveals a strategic hedge. Microsoft owns large stakes in OpenAI and Anthropic, but it is simultaneously positioning itself as the trusted infrastructure and control layer above the labs. That reduces dependence on any single model provider and protects Microsoft's long-term bargaining power. Now, let's connect this directly to Palantir. According to Fortune's reporting, Palantir CEO Alex Karp has been making nearly the same argument as Nadella, but from a different angle. On CNBC, Karp criticized frontier AI labs for extracting proprietary data, processes, and competitive edge from enterprise customers while charging premium token prices, and, in his view, often not delivering equivalent business value. Fortune mentions that Karp says enterprise clients are privately livid with their AI vendors. He accuses frontier labs of focusing on what he calls token maxing rather than solving real, operational problems. For Palantir shareholders, this is important because it validates Palantir's strategic narrative. Palantir's AI platform and foundry pitch is that enterprises should be able to use any AI model, or multiple models, without exposing their proprietary data and workflows. The company frames itself as an operating system and governance layer on top of AI, not as just another model provider. If enterprises genuinely start to believe they are being harvested by frontier labs, that sentiment could drive incremental demand toward vendors that emphasize control, security, and sovereignty. Palantir is almost tailor-made for that theme. Investors should think about a few key implications for Palantir. First, the perceived risk of vendor lock-in to frontier labs raises the value of any platform that can orchestrate many models, both closed and open-weight, inside a highly governed environment. This is exactly what Palantir claims to provide in its AI platform: model routing, fine-grained data access controls, auditability, and the ability to keep sensitive business logic inside the enterprise. Second, if Palantir's narrative is now being echoed by Nadella, that gives Palantir's positioning more legitimacy in boardrooms. Large-cap, blue-chip CIOs might have dismissed a pure-play analytics and defense contractor as biased. But when the CEO of Microsoft is highlighting effectively the same core risk, it reinforces the idea that AI sovereignty is not fringe thinking. It is becoming mainstream enterprise doctrine. Third, this is not purely about ethics, it is also fundamentally about margins and competitive dynamics. If enterprises feel like they are overpaying for frontier API usage and undercapturing the learning value created by their own data, they will look for two levers: cost reduction via open-weight models, and more value capture via proprietary workflows and internal fine-tuning. Palantir is well positioned on both fronts. Its platform can host, orchestrate, and fine-tune open-weight models inside an enterprise's own environment, while wrapping them in operational tooling. That means Palantir can be the infrastructure through which companies shift spending from high-margin frontier APIs to cheaper, possibly self-hosted models, while still paying Palantir for software and integration. Now, zooming back out, Fortune notes a strong open-source angle in this story. According to Fortune News, the backlash against data extraction is nudging enterprises toward open weight models. These are models whose weights are published, allowing anyone to download, run, or modify them. They do not necessarily match the absolute frontier in performance, but they are closing the gap quickly and can be much cheaper and more transparent. For investors, the shift toward open weight models creates a new layer of winners and losers. On the one hand, pure frontier API providers could see pressure on pricing power and stickiness, especially for workloads where good enough open models, enhanced by domain data and better tooling, can replace expensive closed models. On the other hand, companies that control orchestration, security, and vertical workflows can benefit from that shift. The value migrates from the base model to the stack that integrates the model into business processes. Palantir sits squarely in the latter camp. If open weight models become common, the complexity of running, securing, governing, and updating those models at enterprise scale increases. That complexity is exactly where Palantir, and similar platforms, justify their pricing. Microsoft is slightly different. It benefits both as a host for open models through Azure and as a partner to Frontier Labs. But it, too, is steering customers toward a model where data remains in their own controlled environment and can be used to fine-tune or augment whatever models they choose. Fortune also highlights commentary from Versal and Amazon's CTO Werner Vogels. Both indicate that a rising share of traffic and enterprise experimentation is going toward open models. Versal reports that open models already account for a significant share of its AI gateway volume, and Vogels is seeing enterprises shift away from frontier providers to open-source options, driven by cost and transparency. For stock watchers, this is an important behavioral signal. When infrastructure providers at the developer layer and at the cloud layer report a traffic shift, that suggests a real demand trend, not just hype. It also suggests that, over time, the AI market could look more like the Linux ecosystem, a combination of powerful open components and monetization at higher layers in the stack. Where does Palantir fit in such a world? Think of it as a high-value, opinionated enterprise layer on top of that open substrate. Investors should evaluate whether Palantir can remain the preferred integration in governance solution for regulated industries, defense, and operationally complex enterprises as they pivot to mixed model strategies. We should also factor in geopolitical and regulatory risk highlighted by Fortune. According to Fortune, the U.S. government recently blocked access to Anthropic's Fable models. This is a stark example of vendor and regulatory risk. If a company builds mission-critical workflows on top of a single proprietary model and that model becomes inaccessible overnight due to policy changes, sanctions, or security incidents, the business impact could be severe. For investors, that regulatory fragility reinforces the value of model diversification and abstraction layers. Platforms that make it easy to fail over from one model to another, or that support running your own models on your own infrastructure, become more valuable as insurance against political and legal shocks. Palantir has framed its AI platform as precisely that sort of abstraction and continuity layer. It can present a stable interface to business users while swapping underlying models as needed. That plays directly into the risk mitigation story that board-level decision makers care about. It is also an area where hyperscalers like Microsoft and Amazon are building similar tools. Investors should pay attention to which vendors actually show real-world migrations and failovers, not just architectural diagrams. Case studies demonstrating that an enterprise successfully moved from one model family to another, without rewriting all their applications, will be important data points. The article from Fortune also describes an increasingly intense political and regulatory environment around AI. OpenAI staffers are helping fund a super PAC called Guardrails Alliance, which is pushing for stricter AI regulation. This effort is positioned as a counterweight to Leading the Future, a pro-industry PAC backed heavily by OpenAI President Greg Brockman. At the same time, Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei has personally donated a large sum to Public First, another super PAC pushing for mandatory AI safety rules. For investors, the key insight here is that AI regulation is no longer an abstract future risk. It is being actively shaped through political capital and campaign spending. Different labs are funding rival PACs, each promoting their preferred regulatory frameworks. Fortune mentions that leaders of the three major frontier labs, Demis Hassabis at Google DeepMind, Sam Altman at OpenAI, and Dario Amodei at Anthropic have all come out in favor of stronger regulation around frontier AI. They differ on the institutional design, but they share a desire for pre-release testing, certification, and some form of centralized oversight. One risk for investors is that such regulatory regimes might entrench the current frontier labs and lock out smaller players or open-source developers. Compliance burdens tend to favor incumbents with deep legal and policy teams. What does this mean for Palantir's investment thesis? Palantir is not a frontier model lab, it is an application and orchestration company. That may be advantageous. If regulation focuses mainly on training and releasing the largest models, Palantir can operate as a downstream integrator, leaning on whichever regulated models pass certification, while still maintaining its core value proposition, security, governance, and operational integration. At the same time, Palantir has historically benefited from complex, security-sensitive procurement environments, such as defense and intelligence. If AI regulation adds further complexity in compliance requirements for deployments in critical sectors, that could actually create more demand for Palantir's expertise and tooling. The company's reputation for working with governments in high-stakes contexts can become a selling point. On the other hand, investors should be mindful that if regulation becomes overly protective of incumbents at the model layer, innovation in open-weight models could slow, limiting one of Palantir's levers for reducing its customers' dependence on a few high-priced APIs. The trade-off between safety and competition is not trivial, and it introduces long-term uncertainty into any AI-exposed equity. Another part of the Fortune article worth examining from an investor lens is the emergence of new open-weight players like Thinking Machines Lab. According to Fortune, Thinking Machines Lab, led by former OpenAI executive Mira Moradi, has released its first model, called Inkling. Inkling is open-weight and trained to handle audio and video alongside text. The company admits it does not top benchmarks, but it supposedly performs robustly across reasoning, coding, and multimodal tasks. Thinking Machines even used Inkling to fine-tune itself and found that its reasoning traces became more concise over time. Whether or not this holds up under external evaluation, it signals a direction: open-weight models that can be self-improved and specialized by their own users. For investors, the key takeaway is not Inkling's single model performance, but the broader pattern. We now have a pipeline of serious, well-funded teams shipping open-weight alternatives that can compete for enterprise workloads. This intensifies competition at the model layer and, again, shifts value toward platforms that help enterprises select, integrate, and govern models rather than platforms that only sell proprietary endpoints. Palantir benefits from this fragmentation because its value grows as the environment gets more complex. If there is just one dominant model, an enterprise can interface with that model directly. But if there's an expanding ecosystem of open-weight and proprietary models, each with different strengths, costs, and regulatory profiles, then orchestration and governance matter more. Microsoft is also leaning into this. Its message, reported by Fortune, is that companies should have an orchestration layer that lets them switch between AI providers instead of getting locked into a single lab. The fact that both Microsoft and Palantir are converging on this orchestration narrative suggests that investors should treat this as a real structural trend, not a short-term marketing slogan. We should also look at the reputational and ethical dimension reported by Fortune, because it affects brand equity and regulatory risk. According to Fortune's coverage, XAI, Elon Musk's AI company, has sued one of its own users over alleged misuse of its model Grok to generate sexualized deepfakes, including of minors. The company claims it has suspended tens of thousands of accounts and made tens of thousands of reports to child protection authorities, resulting in a meaningful number of arrests. For public market investors, XAI is not yet a listed entity, but these stories matter because they shape public and political attitudes toward generative AI as a whole. The more lawmakers and voters associate AI with harmful deepfakes, exploitation, and abuse, the more likely we are to see strict content and usage rules. That environment tends to favor companies that can demonstrate strong governance, auditability, and compliance capabilities. Palantir has made these themes central to its story. Its platforms are built around traceability, permissions, and responsible use in sensitive domains. If regulatory scrutiny on misuse tightens, enterprises will prioritize vendors that can deliver both powerful AI and detailed audit trails of how that AI was used. This is another way that Palantir's core architecture aligns with emerging risks. Another dimension in Fortune's reporting is internal dissent within major AI companies, such as the resignation of Alex Turner from Google DeepMind over a military deal with the Pentagon. According to Fortune, Turner argued that the deal violated Google's earlier pledge not to build or support lethal autonomous weapons. He said he raised concerns repeatedly, including directly with CEO Demis Hassabis, but ultimately left when the deal went forward and public language around the company's principles was softened. For investors, these internal conflicts show how politically sensitive military and dual-use AI work has become. They also hint at potential internal friction in big tech firms as they pursue lucrative defense and government contracts. Palantir, by contrast, has always been explicit about its willingness to work with defense and intelligence agencies. That clarity can reduce internal friction compared to consumer-focused tech companies that built their brands on utopian, non-military narratives. However, it can also make Palantir a target for criticism from activists and some policymakers. Investors need to be aware that as AI becomes more deeply embedded in national security, companies like Palantir are likely to sit at the center of public debates about where to draw the line. The last section of the Fortune article deals with the scale of political spending around AI and the broader public mood. According to Fortune News, Dario Amodei personally donated a large sum to an Anthropic-aligned super PAC pushing for stronger regulation. Other employees at Anthropic, Google DeepMind, and OpenAI have also contributed significant amounts to pro-regulation political groups. Meanwhile, polling referenced in the article suggests a growing public backlash against AI-driven data center build-outs, particularly over concerns about electricity consumption and potential effects on consumer electric bills. For investors, these are macro headwinds. They raise questions about the cost of capital for data center expansion, future regulation on energy use, and the sustainability of high-intensity AI workloads. They also increase the value of AI applications that deliver clear, measurable productivity gains to offset these perceived costs. Palantir's bull case is that its platforms help enterprises use AI to drive real operational outcomes, higher output with the same headcount, better logistics, more efficient manufacturing, and more effective defense systems. If public opinion turns against AI for AI's sake, but remains open to AI that clearly enhances security, productivity, and resilience, Palantir's positioning could be relatively resilient compared to pure consumer-facing AI plays. That said, investors should continue to watch how energy regulation and climate policy intersect with data center-heavy business models. Many AI-exposed equities, including cloud providers and chip makers, will be vulnerable to sudden shifts in permitted capacity, carbon pricing, or community opposition. So, how should Palantir investors synthesize all of this from Fortune's reporting? First, the highest-level trend is a rebalancing of power and narrative away from purely frontier AI labs and toward enterprise control. Leading voices like Nadella and Karp are telling customers to protect their data, avoid lock-in, and demand that AI serves their interests first. Second, the migration toward open-weight models and model pluralism increases the value of orchestration and governance layers. This is the terrain where Palantir competes, and where its long-running work in security, access control, and auditability becomes a strategic advantage. Third, the growing push for AI regulation, along with rising public skepticism, introduces uncertainty at the model layer but may create steady, long-duration demand for systems integrators who can deploy AI responsibly in high-stakes domains. Fourth, the article underscores that AI is no longer a pure technology story. It is deeply intertwined with politics, defense, ethics, and infrastructure. For Palantir, that intersection is not new. It has always operated at the seam of technology and state power. For investors, that means higher potential upside if Palantir becomes embedded in critical national and commercial systems, but also higher exposure to headline risk, policy swings, and reputational debates. Ultimately, the Fortune piece suggests that the AI market is maturing from an early phase focused on dazzling demos and model benchmarks into a more sober phase centered on data control, cost efficiency, regulatory robustness, and geopolitical resilience. In that phase, the key questions for investors are less about which single model is smartest and more about who owns the rails, who controls the data plumbing, the governance logic, the orchestration stack, and the trusted interfaces between human decision makers and AI systems. Palantir is betting that it will own a meaningful slice of those rails in government, defense, and heavy industry. Microsoft is betting that Azure, plus its orchestration features, will play that role across a broader swath of the economy. Frontier labs are still betting that their models are so advanced that enterprises will tolerate lock-in and data extraction. Fortune's reporting suggests that the tide of elite opinion is turning against that last bet. If that shift continues, it could be structurally supportive for Palantir's long-term story as a sovereign, model-agnostic AI platform. That's it for today's deep dive into how the latest AI power moves, regulatory battles, and open-source advances are reshaping the investment landscape around Palantir and its peers. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you found this analysis helpful, please consider subscribing and sharing the podcast with other investors who are tracking the AI revolution.